I'm Pastor Mark Buetow, and this is another episode of Bible 101. So we're going to pause between Paul's first missionary journey and his second missionary journey. In the book of Acts, chapter 15, we realize and learn that there's conflict in the church. Yes, that's right, the church in which sometimes people have the impression that in the early church, everybody got along and everyone was always happy and because they shared a lot of things and everything was hunky-dory, but there was conflict. When Paul and Barnabas had returned to Antioch, some teachers came down from Judea, and they were saying that people had to be circumcised in order to be a part of the church. And so the question arose whether or not Gentile converts had to be circumcised as their Jewish counterparts were. And so that became a big question in the church, and one of the first things we realized is that some of the conflict in the church is over, well, how are we saved? And these preachers were telling people that in order to be a Christian, in order to be saved, you had to be circumcised. So Paul and Barnabas went down to Jerusalem, and Peter and the other apostles and the elders all got together in what we might call the first church council. The first council of the church at Jerusalem. And they discussed this issue. And one of the things that Peter did was to stand up and say, listen, the Lord has already showed me that the gospel is for all people, even for the Gentiles. Remember this whole story about how I preached to Cornelius, and the Lord showed me that even Gentiles are in. But why would we want to lay upon them a burden that our own people could not keep? And of course here he's referring to the law, all of the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament, including circumcision, which the Jews themselves had not faithfully carried out, which Jesus had fulfilled and therefore abrogated or nullified because these requirements of the ceremonial law no longer applied to Christians. As we saw when Peter was offered by the Lord himself to eat those unclean foods, like, for example, pork chops. So the council decided and they talked and they said, listen, we're going to send a letter to the churches at Antioch and the regions around them, and we're going to say, listen, we are not going to lay a burden of the law upon people so that their consciences are stricken, because we know that God gives grace to Jew and Gentile alike, that we are all saved by grace through Jesus Christ. We will, however, ask them specifically three things: to abstain from eating foods which were sacrificed to idols, to abstain from eating things that have blood and were strangled. That was also an Old Testament law, and also from sexual immorality. Now, what's important to realize about these three particular items is that these were often practices of the pagan religions all around them. So the apostles weren't saying that you had to be saved by following these things. They were simply saying, don't do these things so that we might be distinguished from the false religions and the false gods all around us. And so they sent this letter and they read it and they rejoiced that the gospel, that is the good news of the forgiveness of sins for Jesus' sake, was the basis of salvation, not circumcision, not trying to keep the law, not following all these ceremonial commandments that they had in the Old Testament. So Paul and Barnabas carried that letter back to Antioch, and the church rejoiced at the decision that this first council had made. And so we see that this conflict over how the Jews and Gentiles were brought into the church, over whether the law still applied in this particular instance, whether you had to be circumcised, this conflict was resolved by the apostles, to whom Jesus had given the authority to settle these matters and to, as his witnesses, to declare his word. But those weren't the only kinds of conflicts in the church at the time. Paul and Barnabas were getting ready to set out on their next missionary journey. And Barnabas says, we got to take John Mark. Now, John Mark, one of the disciples, probably the one that wrote the Gospel of Mark, might have been the guy whose house hosted the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, when Jesus celebrated the Passover in the upper room. He had deserted the apostles as they were traveling when they were in Pamphylia. And so Paul says, no, we're not taking John Mark. And Barnabas says, come on, let's take John Mark. He's a good guy. We'll bring him along and he'll help us preach and teach and do all this sort of thing. And Paul says, no, I'm not going to do it. And there actually arose a sharp division between Paul and Barnabas. There was a big disagreement and they didn't resolve it. And so Barnabas went his way, and he took John Mark with him. Paul selected Silas, another disciple, to go with him and then set off on his second missionary journey. They were going to go back and check on all the churches from before. But it's also an important reminder that even in the church, Christians can disagree, and maybe this was something of a personality disagreement. We see later on in Paul's own letters that John Mark was one of the most faithful disciples that helped Paul. But at this point, Paul kind of wanted nothing to do with him, and so he went his own way, and Barnabas went his way. Does that mean the gospel was not preached? Of course not. But it does remind us that Even the apostles, those who were eyewitnesses of Jesus and tasked by him to preach, well, they were sinners too, and so they had their own disagreements. So we see all kinds of disagreements in the church, and this is a reminder for our life in the church today. Sometimes disagreements are over doctrine and teaching and salvation. Sometimes they're personality disagreements. And it's helpful to know the difference between the two so that nothing clouds the fact that we are saved only by grace alone through Jesus Christ as he delivers his forgiveness through water and word and body and blood. But sometimes also we kind of rub each other the wrong way with our faults and our sins, and we have to overlook those too. But those are certainly not church-ending or dividing differences, but they're simply ways in which we practice the forgiveness that we have received for one another. Next time, Paul's next missionary journey on the next episode of Bible 101. I'm Pastor Mark Buetow for Higher Things.